John casually took the stack of bills, approximately 50 of them, and then made a show of drawing out a wallet from his pocket to deposit them. At the same time, he pulled out a fake card from the ATM machine and placed it in his wallet as well. The police officer came to a stop next to John, an ordinary middle-aged man with slightly graying hair and a blue uniform. With a slight pause to brace himself, he started speaking in broken English. "Sir, you need help?" He glanced at John's wallet and said, "Lot of money. Withdraw accident?" John turned to face the police officer and shook his head. In fluent Japanese, he said, "I'm fine. I was thinking about renting an apartment soon and wanted to withdraw cash for a down payment." The officer blinked, the mental gears clearly spurring to a stop at John's words. Still, his professionalism showed as the police officer nodded and responded in Japanese. "I understand, but I think you're mistaken, sir. In Japan, we use agents to handle such things and don't handle pure cash." "Ah." John blinked. He had forgotten about that. Earth actually had people to deal with property, instead of doing trades one-on-one. The police officer gave a friendly smile and said, "Would you like me to bring you to an agency?" John nodded and said, "If you would, I would be grateful, officer." Kimura Takashi." The officer bowed his head. "John Smith." John lowered his head as well and said, "I'm in your care." Officer Kimura raised his head and said, "It's no trouble, Mr. Smith. My job is to help out foreigners like yourself in times like these." Saying that, he started walking, and then gestured for John to follow. John did, but then he frowned and said, "Your job is to help out foreigners?" Officer Kimura nodded. "There hasn't been much going on recently that needs an officer on duty, but I can't just keep my salary without making some effort, can I? That's why an old man like me is out walking the streets." "You're not that old, Officer Kimura." The middle-aged man laughed and said, "Thank you, Mr. Smith. I appreciate your kind words." "Ah." He frowned and said, "Come to think of it, the agency is a fair distance away from here. Do you mind?" John shook his head. "I have all the time in the world, Officer Kimura. Don't worry about rushing." Officer Kimura let out a sigh and said, "It must be nice to be young." He glanced back and said, "From your flawless Japanese, I suppose this is your graduation trip? Have you decided to move here from overseas?" John paused and then nodded. "I'm already a citizen, but I spent a bit of time overseas for business. Looks like I forgot more than I thought I did." "Oh?" Officer Kimura reevaluated John and said, You must be quite successful for one so young then." "You could say that." John rolled his neck and said, "Overseas business is quite lucrative, but time-consuming." He sighed. "I can only imagine, but I suppose there's no place like home in Japan, is there?" "I'll say." John looked around and said, "Japan is definitely a fun place to be in." His memories of the place were foggy, but he remembered that most of the video games he enjoyed came from Japan. And now that he was who he was, he also had the advantage of enjoying the material at the source level, too. Officer Kimura smiled. "It's good to see that, and also to see someone as polite as yourself." John frowned. "Polite?" "I was thinking I was actually being a bit rude, Officer Kimura." No. If anything, you are being too polite. It's fine to just call me Mr. Kimura, and I was speaking in relative terms." He furrowed his brow and said, "Quite a few foreigners around your age arrive with the intent to stay here without even speaking proper Japanese. It can be a bit frustrating, particularly when they are overly aggressive." "Ah," John nodded. That was something that had been true in the Three Realms as well, with the young masters running around. John had to put more than a few of those in their place in the past. "But I suppose that is the trend." Officer Kimura sighed and said, "Japan is growing old, so some new blood, even foreign, is necessary. Times like these are just growing pains." John nodded. It should work out in the end. That is my hope. After that, the conversation turned to idle matters and small talk. Officer Kimura spoke about his family, just a teenage daughter at home after his wife passed away, and then other bits of information about recent news. Meanwhile, John slowly started weaving his backstory while scanning people's minds as they passed by. It was fairly simple, moving to Japan in his teenage years, and then becoming an accountant in his 20s, as well as gaining citizenship at 25 before heading overseas to do some business and recently returning. He would need to do some work later to make sure the pieces made sense, mainly sneaking into the government buildings to lay down the proper foundations and manipulating the memories of a few key individuals. But nothing major. Again, I am amazed at your self-sufficiency, Mr. Smith. John shook his head. It's nothing compared to your struggles, Mr. Kimura. To raise a young child, a daughter at that, all by yourself, it must be difficult. Officer Kimura sighed. It can be, but such is life. John nodded. The two had arrived at a looming commercial building, all glass and steel and towering into the sky. Staring at it, John nodded and said, I suppose this is it. Ah. Officer Kimura glanced at the building and then said, Yes, this is the agency for this district in Tokyo. If you plan to live somewhere else, you would have to speak with them, but I believe the people here can help you find who you need to speak with. John stared at the building, making careful note of the important people inside, and then nodded. Thank you, Mr. Kimura. It's no problem at all, Mr. Smith. Ah, and here. Officer Kimura pulled out a worn black leather wallet from his pocket, and then handed John a card from it. My contact information if you need assistance. It must be difficult to be in a foreign land without relations, so if you ever require help, feel free to contact me. John stared at the card and smiled. I will do so, and thank you again. He took the card and placed it in his wallet. Officer Kimura smiled back, and then he said, With that, I'm afraid I'll have to leave you be. He glanced at a digital time display on the side of a building nearby and said, I need to report back to my superior in an hour, so I should head back now if I want to make it. He laughed and said, It wouldn't be good to be a lousy officer so soon after making such a good impression on you otherwise, would it? That would definitely not be good. Then I'll bid you leave. Officer Kimura bowed at John and said, Until we meet again, Mr. Smith. Take care of yourself. You too, Mr. Kimura. John waved and said, Let's grab a beer sometime after I get things settled. Officer Kimura waved back and then walked away. When he vanished, John turned his attention back to the building. Specifically, he turned his attention to the sign. Tokyo Government Agency Services, huh? Turning around and walking towards an alley, John muttered, Sorry, Mr. Kimura, but I've been through too much to have to deal with more paperwork. Hope you don't mind too much if I take some shortcuts.